No one could explain why an outcast Omega would walk willingly into a whiteout blizzard with 9 newborn wolf pups hidden beneath her worn cloak. Every trail had already disappeared beneath the snow. Every sane traveler had turned back long before nightfall. Yet she kept walking, even as the wind stole the warmth from her hands and the mountains threatened to bury her forever. By dawn, the only signs she had ever existed were scattered footprints and 9 tiny paw prints leading toward the forbidden border between 2 kingdoms that had hated each other for centuries. When the feared Alpha King of Ironfang finally found her, she was half buried beneath ice, her heartbeats so faint that even his royal healers believed she had already crossed into death. But the pups were still alive. Curled against her frozen body, they refused to leave her side. Even the wild wolves surrounding them stood in complete silence, as though guarding someone far more important than an ordinary Omega. No one understood why. Why would wolves obey the weakest woman in the kingdom? Why had the ancient shrine awakened on the very night she disappeared? And why did the oldest prophecy whisper that when winter refused to end, salvation would arrive not through the strength of a king, but through the compassion of one forgotten heart? The wind had erased the world. Snow fell so heavily that the mountains, forests, and frozen rivers blended into a single endless sheet of white, swallowing every landmark the ice searched for. The storm had raged through the night without mercy, burying roads, silencing streams, and driving even the fiercest predators into hidden dens. Yet somewhere within that blinding wilderness, a lone figure continued walking. She was small against the storm. A faded gray cloak whipped wildly behind her as she leaned into the wind with slow, determined steps. One arm held the bundle beneath her coat tightly against her chest, shielding it from the icy air with every bit of warmth her exhausted body still possessed. Snow clung to her hair until it looked woven from frost itself. Her boots disappeared beneath drifts with every step, leaving behind only shallow footprints that vanished moments later beneath fresh snowfall. 9 tiny heartbeats rested beneath that worn cloak. 9 newborn wolf pups, no larger than rabbits, slept against one another, their soft breaths rising in faint clouds of warmth that disappeared almost instantly into the freezing air. No one could explain why an outcast Omega would willingly walk into a whiteout blizzard carrying 9 helpless lives. By sunrise, only scattered paw prints would remain, leading toward the forbidden border where 2 rival kingdoms had hated one another for generations. And before another night had passed, the feared Alpha King himself would kneel beside her frozen body, not because she was royalty, not because she possessed unimaginable power, but because the oldest laws of the wolves had always chosen the same kind of soul, not the strongest, the kindest. Long before the storm began, the kingdom of Frostveil had already forgotten what spring looked like. Winter had ruled the northern mountains for nearly 7 years without interruption. Snow-covered rooftops that had once been painted with warm colors. Ancient pine forests bent beneath heavy blankets of ice, their branches groaning whenever cold winds swept through the valleys. Even the rivers had surrendered, trapped beneath thick layers of frozen crystal that reflected only pale gray skies. Children born during the endless winter believed flowers existed only in old stories. The people rarely laughed anymore. Every sunrise brought another struggle for food. Every sunset counted another family that had left the village hoping to find game and never returned. Above everything stood Frostveil Keep, carved directly into the mountainside. Its towering stone walls overlooked every cottage below like a silent giant wrapped in snow. Long blue banners carrying the silver wolf crest snapped violently in the icy wind. From those walls ruled Alpha Cedric. Powerful, respected, feared. Few dared question his commands. Fewer still survived doing so. Far beneath the castle, tucked behind the kitchens and stable yards, stood a small weathered cottage where servants lived. That was where Elara called home, if it could even be called that. The tiny room held little more than a narrow bed stuffed with old straw, a wooden table worn smooth with age, and a single cracked window that let cold air slip inside every night. Frost decorated the corners of the walls no matter how large the fire burned. Not that she often had enough wood for one. Every morning before dawn, while the village still slept beneath darkness, Elara was already awake. She carried buckets of frozen water from the well. She swept snow from the castle steps. She washed blood from hunters' clothing. She cleaned kitchens after feasts she was never invited to join. By the time sunlight finally reached the valley, her hands were already cracked from cold water and hard labor. Most people barely noticed her. She had been an Omega her entire life. In Frostveil, that meant weakness. It meant serving everyone else. It meant standing aside whenever an Alpha entered the room. Children learned those rules before they learned to write. Elara never argued. She simply smiled, not because life was fair, because somewhere inside her remained the quiet belief that bitterness only spread more darkness. Even after everything she had lost. Years earlier, when she had still been a little girl, her parents had vanished during a border conflict with the neighboring Ironfang kingdom. No bodies had ever returned. Only silence. Some believed Ironfang soldiers had taken them. Others whispered darker things about creatures wandering the mountain passes after sunset. No answer ever came. Only absence. Since then, the village had slowly forgotten their names. Elara never did. Sometimes, while carrying water before sunrise, she imagined hearing her mother's voice beneath the wind. Sometimes she caught herself looking toward the northern peaks, wondering whether someone, somewhere, had once searched for her just as desperately. Those thoughts never lasted long. Work always called. Yet despite carrying loneliness like another layer of clothing, something inside Elara refused to harden. She noticed hungry children before anyone else did. If an elderly villager slipped while walking across frozen streets, she was always the first person kneeling beside them. When hunters returned with injured sled dogs, she quietly stayed after everyone left, washing wounds and wrapping paws with strips torn from her own blankets. The animals remembered. Some mornings she would find birds perched quietly outside her window. Foxes occasionally lingered near the edge of the forest instead of running away. Even frightened horses settled whenever she approached. People rarely thanked her. The animals never needed to. One afternoon, as thick gray clouds gathered once again above Frostveil, Elara carried a basket of herbs toward the village healer. The streets were unusually quiet. Most families had already barred their doors against the coming storm. A young boy sat alone beside the frozen fountain, staring silently at the empty bowl in his lap. Perhaps 6 years old. Thin enough that his oversized coat hung loosely around him. Elara slowed. "You haven't eaten today, have you?" The boy lowered his eyes without answering. She looked inside her basket. Only one small loaf remained. It was supposed to be her supper. She hesitated for barely a heartbeat before placing it gently into his hands. His eyes widened. "But you need it more than I do." He looked at the bread, then back at her. "You'll be hungry." She smiled softly. "I'll survive." The boy held the loaf against his chest as though it were treasure. Long after Elara had disappeared down the snowy street, he continued watching her. Sometimes kindness left deeper footprints than power ever could. By evening, the storm arrived. The first gusts slammed against Frostveil, keep hard enough to rattle wooden shutters throughout the village. Snow poured from the sky in thick, swirling waves. Visibility disappeared almost instantly. Castle guards shouted warnings while villagers hurried indoors. Stable doors were secured. Lanterns extinguished. Travel became impossible. Inside the kitchens, servants whispered nervously while stacking supplies. "The hunters are still outside. They won't make it back." "I've never seen clouds this black." Old women quietly traced ancient protection symbols across their doorframes. Even seasoned warriors avoided looking toward the mountains. Storms like this carried stories. Not all of them human. Near midnight, while securing firewood behind the kitchens, Elara heard it. A sound so faint she almost believed the wind had imagined it.
A cry. Soft.
Fragile.
Gone almost instantly.
She froze. The storm screamed around her. Nothing.
Then,
again. Not human. Not quite. She stepped away from the shelter. Another cry drifted across the wind. Tiny.
Weak.
Desperate, her heart tightened. She grabbed the nearest lantern despite knowing it would barely survive outside. Behind her, another servant called through the doorway. "Where are you going?" "I heard something. In this storm, you'll die out there." But Elara was already walking into the darkness. The lantern shook violently in her hand as wind pushed against every step. Snow struck her face like handfuls of tiny stones. Within minutes, the castle lights vanished behind white curtains of drifting ice. Only instinct guided her now. Again,
The cry.
closer. She climbed over fallen branches, nearly buried beneath snow. Her boots slipped repeatedly across hidden patches of ice. The lantern finally died, leaving only pale moonlight filtering weakly through racing clouds. Still she continued. The sound became clearer. Then suddenly, silence.
She stopped.
Only the wind remained. Had she imagined everything? Her breathing slowed. Then movement. A raven lifted from the snow-covered branches nearby, startling her before disappearing into the storm. Below the tree, something darker than the snow. She approached slowly. At first it looked like another fallen log. Then the shape shifted beneath drifting snow. A wolf. Huge. Its silver fur almost completely buried beneath ice. Blood stained the snow beneath its side. The animal barely breathed. Its pale blue eyes opened as Elara knelt nearby. There was no anger inside them. Only exhaustion. Only one final plea. Then Elara heard it again. Tiny cries. Beneath the wolf's body, her hands trembled as she carefully brushed snow aside. One pup, then another, then another. She counted softly beneath her breath. 6, 7,
8.
9. 9 newborn pups huddled together beneath their dying mother, their eyes still closed, their tiny bodies trembling from the bitter cold. The great wolf lifted her head once, just enough to look directly into Elara's eyes. For one impossibly still moment, neither moved. Then the mother slowly nudged the nearest pup toward her. A silent request. A mother's final wish. Moments later, her head settled gently back into the snow. She never moved again. The wind seemed to fall strangely quiet. Elara swallowed hard, blinking away tears that instantly froze against her lashes. "I promise," she whispered into the storm, her voice barely louder than the falling snow. "I won't leave them." She reached for the first tiny pup, unaware that just beyond the trees, half buried beneath centuries of ice, an ancient stone shrine watched in silence, its weathered symbols beginning to glow with a faint silver light for the first time in generations. Morning never truly arrived. The storm simply traded darkness for a pale gray sky that offered no warmth and no direction. Snow still drifted across the mountains in restless waves, smoothing every ridge and burying every path as though the world wished to hide its own secrets. Kneeling beside the silent body of the great she-wolf, Elara gathered the 9 pups into her cloak one by one. They were so small that each fit easily into the curve of her arm, their soft cries barely louder than the wind itself. One tiny silver pup pressed its nose against her hand before curling beside its brothers and sisters, as though it already understood that the warmth surrounding them belonged to a stranger who had chosen them over her own safety. She lowered her head toward the fallen mother. "I'll keep my promise." The words disappeared into the storm, but something in the frozen forest seemed to hear them. The faint silver glow surrounding the ancient shrine brightened for a single heartbeat before fading once more beneath the drifting snow. Elara tightened the worn leather cord around her cloak, drawing the pups close against her chest. Their small bodies trembled with cold, and she could feel each fragile heartbeat through the layers of cloth. They needed shelter before another night fell. They needed milk. They needed a future that the frozen mountain could never offer. She turned toward Frostveil, then stopped. If she carried the pups back to the village, Alpha Cedric would see them. She could already hear his cold voice ordering the hunters to leave them where they belonged. Strange wolves were never welcomed inside Frostveil, especially not during the harshest winter anyone could remember. Fear ruled the kingdom more than kindness ever had. Her gaze drifted to the distant northern peaks instead. Beyond them lay the forbidden border. Beyond that, Ironfang, the enemy. The kingdom every child in Frostveil had been taught to hate before they were old enough to understand why. Elara drew a slow breath. She had no reason to trust Ironfang, but she had every reason not to trust the Alpha who ruled her own home. Without another glance behind her, she stepped deeper into the wilderness. Hours passed beneath an endless curtain of white. Each step demanded more strength than the last. Snow swallowed her boots almost to her knees, forcing her to lift her legs again and again until every muscle burned with exhaustion. The wind slipped beneath her cloak, stealing warmth from her skin, but she wrapped the fabric tighter around the pups instead of herself. Whenever one whimpered, she paused just long enough to rub its tiny back with her fingertips. "It's all right," she whispered. I know. The smallest black pup struggled to breathe, its little body shaking harder than the others. Elara searched her satchel until she found the last strip of wool she owned. It had once wrapped her own neck during winter nights. Without hesitation, she folded it into a tiny nest around the shivering pup. Her own throat immediately felt the sting of icy air. She ignored it. The pups needed every bit of warmth she could give. By midday, hunger gnawed at her stomach with sharp, empty pains. Inside her satchel remained one small piece of dried bread. She broke it into tiny crumbs and let them dissolve into warm snow water, hoping the scent alone might comfort the pups. She swallowed nothing herself. The emptiness could wait. Their lives could not. The forest slowly changed around her. The trees grew taller, older. Their trunks were wrapped in thick silver moss that glowed faintly beneath layers of frost. Strange blue birds watched silently from branches overhead, never flying away as she passed. Even the wind seemed quieter here, softened by towering pines that had stood for centuries. Then came another sound. Footsteps. Not human.
Soft.
Measured. Crunch. 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 Elara froze. The sound stopped. She slowly turned her head. Nothing. Only drifting snow between endless trees. She continued walking. The footsteps returned. Always behind her. Always matching her pace. Fear tightened inside her chest, but she refused to run. Running through deep snow would only leave her exhausted. She walked another 100 steps before daring another glance. This time she saw them. Gray shapes moving silently between the trees.
1.
Then 3. Then 6. Wolves. Large.
Wild.
Their thick winter coats blended so perfectly with the forest that they seemed carved from the storm itself. Golden eyes watched her without blinking. Yet none of them lowered their ears. None bared their teeth. None crept forward like hunters closing on prey. They simply followed. Watching. Waiting. The largest wolf stepped into a narrow shaft of pale light, its broad shoulders towering above the snowdrifts. A faded scar crossed one eye, giving the old animal a stern, weathered face. Elara slowly lowered her gaze. I won't hurt them. The wolf remained perfectly still. One tiny silver pup pushed its head from beneath her cloak and released a soft cry. At once, every wolf lifted its ears. The old wolf lowered its massive head. Not in surrender. In recognition. Moments later, it turned and disappeared between the trees. The others followed. Within seconds, the forest stood empty once again. Elara blinked in disbelief. The wolves had not hunted her. They had escorted her. Far behind her, Frostveil had awakened to chaos. The stable master was the first to discover her absence. By sunrise, servants searched every corner of the keep. By noon, hunters had found her tracks leading toward the mountains. Alpha Cedric stood inside the great hall with one gloved hand resting on the carved arm of his throne. His face remained calm, but his pale eyes carried the stillness of frozen steel. She left willingly, he asked. A captain knelt before him. Yes, my Alpha. And the wolf?
Dead.
The pups? The captain hesitated. Gone. Silence settled over the hall. Several elders exchanged uneasy glances. At last, one elderly advisor stepped forward, his beard nearly white with age. My Alpha, the markings near the shrine? Cedric's eyes narrowed. You saw them? The old man nodded slowly. The Moonline seal. The room seemed colder. For several long moments, Cedric said nothing. Then he rose from his throne. No one outside this hall learns what was found. My Alpha. If those pups truly belong to the Moonline. His voice dropped until it was barely louder than the crackling fire. They must never reach Ironfang. The captain looked confused. They're only newborns. Cedric's expression hardened. So were kings once. He turned toward the towering windows where snow continued falling over Frostveil. Take every tracker we have. Search every valley, every forest, every cave. His eyes darkened. And if the Omega refuses to surrender them. He never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. The hunters understood. Within the hour, horns echoed across the valley as mounted trackers disappeared into the storm. Unaware of the hunt gathering behind her, Elara finally reached the edge of a frozen river just before sunset. Her legs trembled so badly she nearly collapsed. The pups slept quietly now, exhausted from the journey. Across the river stood the black outlines of mountains unlike any she had ever seen. The border. Beyond those peaks, Ironfang. She looked up just as the wind shifted. Fresh tracks crossed the snow before her. Not wolf tracks. Horse tracks. Many of them. Still sharp. Still new. Someone had passed only moments earlier. Then another sound drifted through the falling snow. A distant horn.
Low.
Powerful. Not from Frostveil. From the north. Elara slowly pulled the pups closer against her heart. She had escaped one danger. She had just stepped into another. And somewhere beyond the white horizon, a king who had never heard her name was already following the impossible trail of a lone Omega and 9 wolf pups the ancient world refused to forget. By the time the sun should have risen, the sky remained a dull sheet of silver, offering neither light nor warmth. The frozen river stretched before Elara like polished stone, its surface hidden beneath layers of drifting snow. Somewhere beneath the ice, dark water still flowed, slow and patient, waiting for a single careless step to claim another traveler. She stood at its edge, with the 9 pups tucked safely beneath her cloak, listening to the distant horn that had echoed across the mountains. It had faded now, swallowed by the wind, but its warning lingered inside her chest. Behind her lay Frostveil. Ahead waited Ironfang. For generations, mothers had frightened their children with stories of the rival kingdom. They spoke of towering warriors draped in wolf pelts, of black fortresses carved into cliffs, of kings who settled every disagreement with blood. Elara had believed those stories once. Now she wondered how many had been born from fear rather than truth. She knelt beside the river and brushed away a layer of fresh snow. The ice beneath looked thick, crossed by long white veins that disappeared into the distance. It might hold her weight. It might not. The smallest black pup stirred against her chest and released a faint whimper. I know, she whispered, gently rubbing its tiny back. I'm trying. A sharp gust swept across the river, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant smoke. There were people somewhere beyond those mountains. Shelter.
Fire.
Perhaps even hope. Taking a slow breath, Elara stepped onto the ice. A soft crack echoed beneath her boot. She froze. Nothing else moved. The wind continued its lonely song across the empty valley. Carefully, she shifted her weight forward and took another step. Then another. Each footfall felt like a question asked of the frozen river, and each answer came in the form of silence. The pups remained curled together beneath her cloak, warmed by one another's tiny bodies. Their breathing rose and fell in quiet rhythm against her heart, giving her the strength to keep moving. Halfway across, the world changed. The wind stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. The sudden stillness was so complete that Elara could hear her own heartbeat. She looked around. Snowflakes drifted lazily instead of racing through the air. The towering pines on both sides of the river stood perfectly still, their branches untouched by even the smallest breeze. Then she noticed them. Wolf tracks. Dozens of them. They emerged from the forest behind her, crossed the river in perfect lines, and disappeared toward Ironfang. Some were enormous, far larger than any ordinary wolf she had ever seen. Yet she hadn't seen a single animal leave them. A shiver ran through her. The old stories returned to her mind. Her grandmother had once spoken of the Moon Mother's guardians, wolves that appeared only when destiny itself walked the northern mountains. Elara had laughed then, believing them to be little more than bedtime tales. Standing alone upon the frozen river, those stories no longer felt impossible. A tiny silver pup suddenly lifted its head. Its eyes, still barely open, fixed on something behind her. Elara turned. At the far end of the river stood a massive white wolf. Its coat blended so perfectly with the snow that only its amber eyes gave it away. The animal neither growled nor advanced. It simply watched. For several long moments, neither moved. Then, with slow dignity, the wolf lowered its head. Not in submission. In greeting. Before Elara could react, it turned and disappeared into the forest beyond the river. The silence ended. The wind returned in a single powerful rush, sending snow swirling across the ice once more. She hurried the remaining distance, never looking back. The forest beyond the border felt different. The trees grew taller than those in Frostveil, their trunks wrapped with deep green moss that somehow survived the endless winter. Strange blue crystals hung naturally from the branches, catching what little daylight remained and scattering it into soft glimmers across the snow. Birdsong echoed overhead. It was faint, but it existed. Elara hadn't heard birds sing in months. The sound almost brought tears to her eyes. As she followed a narrow animal trail between the ancient pines, she noticed signs of life everywhere. Deer tracks crossed the snow. Rabbits darted beneath frost-covered bushes. Even the air smelled different, carrying the clean scent of cedar instead of smoke and hunger. Perhaps Ironfang was not untouched by winter. Perhaps it had simply learned to survive alongside it. By late afternoon, exhaustion began claiming her body once again. Her legs felt heavy. Her breathing had become shallow. She stumbled over a hidden root and fell to one knee, quickly shielding the pups before they touched the snow. "I'm all right," she whispered more to herself than to them. When she tried to stand again, dizziness blurred her vision. She leaned against the trunk of an enormous pine, closing her eyes for only a moment. A soft bark startled her awake. She blinked. A red fox stood several yards away. It wasn't alone. Behind it rested the body of a freshly caught snow hare. The fox looked at Elara, then at the hare. Without touching its catch again, it quietly disappeared into the trees. Elara stared after it in disbelief. The animal had left it. She approached cautiously, expecting the fox to return. It never did. Kneeling in the snow, she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude before preparing a small fire hidden beneath an overhanging rock. She cooked only enough to regain a little strength, saving every scrap she could. Though the pups were still too young for solid food, the warmth from the fire revived them, and their tiny cries grew stronger than they had been since leaving the shrine. Night settled gently over the forest. For the first time in days, Elara allowed herself to believe they might survive. She was wrong. Far above the valley, hidden among dark cliffs, a lone rider watched the thin column of smoke rising through the trees. He wore black armor trimmed with silver fur. A wolf-shaped clasp held his heavy cloak against the cold. Beside him stood a towering gray wolf whose scarred muzzle lifted toward the wind. The animal inhaled once, then looked directly toward Elara's camp. The rider followed its gaze. "She's closer than the scouts believed," he said quietly. One of the soldiers behind him frowned. "A Frostveil spy?" The rider remained silent for a long moment.
No.
His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Something far more unusual. Without another word, he mounted his horse. Snow drifted from the cliffs as dozens of riders silently followed. None of them knew that before another sunrise, their feared king would come face to face with the exhausted Omega whose compassion had already begun to awaken legends long buried beneath the endless winter. Night settled over the northern forest with a silence unlike anything Elara had ever known. It was not the uneasy quiet that covered Frostveil before another command from its alpha shattered the peace. This silence felt ancient, as though the towering pines had been standing watch since the first snowfall the world had ever seen. The small fire beneath the overhanging rock had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft orange light across the sleeping pups curled tightly together inside her cloak. Their tiny bodies rose and fell in peaceful rhythm, each breath carrying a little more strength than the one before. For the first time since leaving Frostveil, hope dared to settle beside her. It was fragile, no larger than the smallest flame, but it was there. She rested her head against the rough bark of the pine behind her, though sleep refused to come. Every sound drew her attention. The whisper of branches overhead, the distant cry of an owl, the soft crack of ice somewhere deep within the forest. Her body begged for rest, but her heart remained alert. She knew Alpha Cedric would not abandon the hunt. He had looked upon those pups with fear, not pity, and fear often drove powerful men to commit terrible acts. One of the silver pups stirred. Its tiny nose twitched before it crawled slowly across the blanket and pressed itself against Elara's hand. She smiled faintly, stroking its impossibly soft fur with a single finger. "You should be sleeping," she whispered. The little wolf opened one pale blue eye. For a brief moment, Elara could have sworn the tiny creature was looking beyond her instead of at her. Then every pup lifted its head at once. 9 pairs of ears stood perfectly still.
The forest had changed.
The wind no longer carried the scent of pine alone. It carried horses. Elara's heart skipped. She quickly covered the fire with fresh snow until only darkness remained beneath the rocky shelter. Gathering the pups beneath her cloak, she listened as faint hoofbeats echoed through the trees. They were slow, careful. Whoever approached was not blindly searching. They already knew someone was nearby. A line of torchlight appeared between distant trunks.
Not one.
Not 2. Dozens. The flames moved steadily through the forest, like glowing eyes drifting between the snow-covered pines. Elara held her breath. The pups remained strangely quiet. Even the smallest black pup, who usually whimpered whenever the cold returned, made no sound at all. The rider stopped less than 100 yards away. She heard voices carried by the night air. "Tracks end here." "No," they continue. "They're lighter." "She's exhausted." The words were calm,
disciplined.
Nothing like the shouting Frostveil patrols she had grown accustomed to hearing. Then another voice spoke.
Deep. Steady.
Every other rider fell silent before it. Spread out. No one questioned the command. Within moments, the torchlights separated, disappearing into different parts of the forest. Elara realized with growing dread that hiding beneath the rocks would only delay the inevitable. The search was closing. A twig snapped nearby. She slowly turned. Standing no more than 20 steps away was the massive gray wolf she had seen upon the cliffs. Moonlight traced the old scars across its broad muzzle. Its golden eyes never left hers. It did not growl. It did not crouch to attack. Instead, the wolf calmly sat upon the snow, watching, waiting. A shadow emerged from the trees behind it.
Tall.
Broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark cloak lined with silver fur. Snow settled across polished black armor marked with the crest of a wolf beneath a rising moon. The stranger removed the hood covering his head. His dark hair was touched with frost, and his gray eyes studied Elara with quiet caution rather than open suspicion. This could only be one man. Kalen, Alpha King of Ironfang. Every story she had ever heard warned that meeting him meant death. Yet the man before her did not reach for the sword resting at his side. His gaze drifted instead toward the bundle beneath her cloak. "So the stories are true," he said softly. His voice carried no anger, only wonder. Elara instinctively stepped backward. "You'll take them?" "If I intended that," Kalen replied, "my soldiers would already have done so." She looked beyond him. Not a single bough was raised. No spear pointed toward her. The soldiers remained where they stood, waiting for their king's command. Kalen slowly knelt in the snow several paces away, making himself appear less threatening. His old wolf remained beside him, perfectly still. "I've been following your trail since yesterday." Elara tightened her hold on the pups. "I won't give them to anyone." I can see that. They've done nothing wrong. I know. Her breathing remained uneven. You don't. Kaelin was silent for a moment before answering. My scouts found the shrine. Those words froze her where she stood. The Moonline's seal has awakened, he continued quietly. It has slept for nearly 300 years. You know about it? My grandfather spent his life searching for proof that it still existed. The king's eyes settled upon the pups again. And now an Omega walks through the deadliest storm in decades, carrying 9 heirs the old legends claimed would never be born. Elara's pulse quickened. Heirs? Before Kaelin could answer, the gray wolf suddenly rose. Its ears flattened. A low growl rolled through the darkness. Every horse in the clearing became restless. The king stood instantly. What is it? The wolf faced south, toward Frostveil. A heartbeat later, another howl echoed through the mountains. Then another.
Not the call of wild wolves.
War horns. Kaelin's expression hardened. They found you. Torches appeared between the distant trees. Far more than before. Unlike Ironfang's orderly search, these lights moved aggressively, scattering through the forest as shouting voices broke the night's silence. Search every trail. She can't be far. Bring back the pups. One harsh command rose above the rest. And if the Omega resists. The unfinished sentence was followed by cruel laughter. Elara felt the color drain from her face. Kaelin looked toward his captain. Get her out of here. My king.
Now.
The captain hesitated only a second before signaling the soldiers. Several riders moved forward, but not toward the pups. They formed a protective circle around Elara instead. She stared at them in disbelief. Why are you helping me? Kaelin drew his sword as more torchlight flooded through the trees. The polished steel reflected the firelight like frozen silver. Because, he answered without looking away from the approaching enemy. Whatever those pups truly are. His scarred wolf stepped to his side, teeth bared toward the darkness. They chose the one person willing to risk everything for them. The first Frostveil arrow burst from the forest, slicing through the night toward the Ironfang king. And with that single shot, the long-frozen peace between the rival kingdoms shattered once again. The arrow never reached its target. With a blur of gray fur, Kaelin's scarred wolf sprang into its path, striking the shaft aside before it could cross the clearing. The arrow spun harmlessly into the snow, disappearing beneath a cloud of white powder. For one frozen heartbeat, neither side moved. The only sound was the wind weaving through the towering pines and the frightened breaths of horses stamping against the icy ground. Then the forest erupted. More arrows hissed through the darkness as Frostveil hunters burst between the trees, their white cloaks blending with the storm until they seemed like ghosts racing across the snow. Ironfang's shields rose in perfect unison. Steel rang against steel as Kaelin's warriors formed a protective wall, not charging forward, but holding their ground. Behind them, Elara instinctively curled herself around the 9 pups, shielding them beneath her cloak, while the world dissolved into chaos around her. Take the Omega, shouted a Frostveil captain. No, another voice answered, colder than the winter itself. Take the pups. Elara recognized that voice. Alpha Cedric. He emerged from the swirling snow atop a massive black horse, its armor etched with a silver crest of Frostveil. Snow clung to his broad shoulders, but his pale eyes remained fixed on the bundle beneath Elara's cloak. There was no relief in his expression at finding one of his own people alive. Only calculation. Only hunger. So, Cedric said calmly, the stories were true. Kaelin stepped forward until he stood between Cedric and Elara. You crossed into my lands with armed soldiers. I came for what belongs to Frostveil. Those pups belong to no kingdom. Cedric's lips curled into the faintest smile. That is where you are mistaken. The wind carried silence between the 2 rulers. Even the wolves hidden among the trees remained perfectly still. Cedric slowly removed one leather glove, revealing an old scar stretching across his palm. It glowed faintly beneath the moonlight, as though ancient magic still lingered beneath the skin. 300 years ago, he said, the Moonline swore loyalty to the Northern Throne. They were guardians of the Covenant until they betrayed their king. Kaelin's expression hardened. History written by tyrants rarely tells the whole truth. Cedric ignored the remark. When they refused to surrender their bloodline, they were hunted. Every den destroyed. Every heir erased. His gaze settled once more upon the sleeping pups. Or so we believed. A cold weight settled inside Elara's chest. The pups, they had been hunted long before they were born. Kaelin spoke quietly, but every word carried across the clearing. The Moonline did not betray the throne. Cedric laughed once. A convenient version. They refused to serve a king who demanded fear instead of justice. The smile disappeared from Cedric's face. Justice has never protected a kingdom. No, Kaelin replied. People do. For a long moment, neither alpha moved. Then Cedric raised one hand. Every Frostveil archer drew another arrow. Kaelin did the same. His soldiers lowered their spears. The clearing stood one heartbeat away from war. Suddenly, a tiny cry echoed through the silence. The smallest black pup had awakened. Its weak little voice carried farther than seemed possible. Every wolf in the surrounding forest lifted its head. One howl answered, then another, then dozens more. The mountains themselves seemed to awaken. Snow drifted from branches as wolves emerged from every direction. Gray wolves, white wolves, black wolves with silver-tipped fur. They stepped quietly between the trees, surrounding the clearing in a wide circle. Not attacking, watching. Cedric's horse became restless. Several Frostveil mounts reared in panic. Ironfang's wolves remained calm. The oldest among the wild pack walked slowly toward Elara before lowering its head beside her. One by one, the others followed, until a living ring of wolves surrounded the exhausted Omega and the 9 sleeping pups. None obeyed either king. They obeyed something else. Cedric's confidence faltered for the first time. This is impossible. Kaelin looked not at the wolves, but at Elara. They have chosen. They're only animals.
No.
Kaelin's voice softened. They remember. Confusion filled Elara's eyes. Remember what? Before either king could answer, an elderly woman stepped from the Ironfang ranks. She wore simple gray robes instead of armor, and an ancient staff carved from white ash rested in her hands. Deep lines crossed her weathered face, but her silver eyes remained bright. The old promises, she said. Everyone fell silent. Even Cedric did not interrupt. The Moonline wolves never served crowns. They served the keeper. Her gaze rested gently upon Elara, the one whose heart values every life equally. Elara shook her head. You have the wrong person. The old woman smiled sadly. A true keeper always says those words. She slowly knelt before the young Omega. When your hands first touched those pups. She reached toward the nearest wolf, who calmly rested its head against her robe. The Covenant awakened. Cedric's patience finally broke. Enough. He drew his sword. I will not lose everything because of an orphan Omega and a handful of wolves. He urged his horse forward. The wolves immediately stepped between him and Elara. Not snarling, not lunging, simply standing together. Cedric raised his blade, then stopped. None of the wolves flinched. Not one. The king's hand trembled ever so slightly. Not from fear. From recognition. He had seen this before. Long ago. As a child. The memory flashed across his face before disappearing behind anger. Kaelin noticed. So you do remember. Cedric remained silent. The old woman closed her eyes. The truth has followed you for many years, Cedric. His voice became sharp. The truth buried my father.
No.
She looked directly at him. His ambition did. Those words struck harder than any sword. For the first time, uncertainty crossed the Frostveil soldiers' faces. They looked toward their king, then toward the wolves, then toward the young Omega whose only weapon had been compassion. Snow began falling again. Softly. Not with the violence of the previous storm, but gently, almost peacefully. One delicate snowflake landed upon the forehead of the silver pup. Its tiny body suddenly shimmered with a faint silver glow. Then another pup glowed. Then another. Within seconds, all 9 were surrounded by threads of pale moonlight that rose into the sky like dancing ribbons. The ancient wolves bowed their heads. The old woman whispered a prayer in a language no one else understood. Kalen lowered his sword. Even Cedric stared in stunned silence. Far beyond the clearing, deep beneath the frozen mountains, something answered. A low rumble rolled through the earth. Ice cracked. Ancient doors sealed for centuries slowly began to open. The Covenant had not merely awakened. It was calling its keeper home. The mountain did not awaken with violence. It awakened with memory. A deep, resonant hum rolled beneath the frozen earth, so ancient that it seemed to rise from the bones of the world itself. Snow drifted from towering cliffs in glittering curtains, while sheets of ice that had remained untouched for centuries cracked with slow, echoing groans. Every wolf in the clearing lifted its head toward the northern peaks. Not one of them howled. They simply listened. The 9 pups stirred beneath Elara's cloak. Their silver light faded until only a faint glow remained beneath their soft fur, but their tiny ears remained raised, as though they could hear a distant voice calling their names. The elderly seer rested one hand against her ashwood staff and looked toward the mountains with tears glistening in her weathered eyes. "The Covenant Hall has opened," she whispered. "I prayed I would live long enough to see this day." Cedric's face hardened. "No one enters that mountain. It is no longer yours to forbid," Kalen answered quietly. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty spread through the Frostveil ranks. Soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Many had grown up hearing tales of the Covenant Hall as nothing more than a legend told around winter fires. Yet the trembling earth beneath their boots made the old stories impossible to dismiss. Cedric refused to yield. Seize the Omega. None of his warriors moved. They looked at the ring of wolves surrounding Elara, then toward the distant mountain whose frozen gates had awakened after centuries of silence. One captain slowly lowered his spear. "My Alpha." Cedric turned sharply. "You question my order?" The captain swallowed hard. "I question why the wolves stand with her." The words hung heavily in the cold air. Cedric's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could answer, another rumble echoed across the valley. High above them, sunlight finally pierced the thick blanket of clouds for the first time in many seasons. A single golden beam fell across the mountain, revealing enormous stone doors emerging from the ice. Carved into them was the image of a woman kneeling beside a wolf. Not a queen, not a warrior, a guardian. The same posture Elara had taken beside the dying she-wolf only days before. The old seer smiled sadly. The mountain remembers compassion. The journey north began before the light faded. Kalen ordered a small company to travel with Elara, while the rest of Ironfang's army remained behind to prevent Cedric from advancing. Though the Frostveil Alpha glared in silent fury, he knew forcing another battle among so many awakened wolves would cost countless lives. "This isn't over," Cedric said, his voice cold enough to rival the wind. Kalen met his gaze, without flinching.
No.
"It is only beginning." As Elara passed between the waiting soldiers, she noticed something she never expected. Several Frostveil warriors bowed their heads. Not to a queen. Not to prophecy. To the young Omega, who had risked everything for 9 helpless lives. She lowered her eyes in return, unable to find words. The forest beyond the valley felt transformed. The endless silence that had haunted the northern wilderness was slowly giving way to life. Birds returned to branches that had stood empty for years. Beneath melting snow, narrow streams whispered once more beneath sheets of crystal ice. Even the scent of the air had changed, carrying hints of damp earth hidden beneath winter's frozen grip. The pups seemed to notice first. No longer content to remain tucked inside Elara's cloak, they peeked out with bright, curious eyes. One after another, they watched every fluttering bird and every darting squirrel with growing wonder. The smallest black pup climbed onto her shoulder and stubbornly refused to climb back down. A faint laugh escaped Elara before she could stop it. Kalen glanced toward her. "You've smiled." She looked almost embarrassed. "I forgot what it felt like." For a moment, neither king nor prophecy mattered. Only a woman, 9 growing pups, and the quiet sound of laughter carried through the trees. By the third day, the mountains rose before them like sleeping giants. The Covenant Hall stood hidden within the tallest peak, its entrance uncovered where ancient ice had split apart. Massive pillars carved from white stone lined the path upward, each bearing the likeness of wolves beside ordinary men and women. No crowns, no thrones, only partnership. The old seer traced her fingers across one weathered carving. Long before kingdoms fought over borders, rulers were judged by the creatures willing to walk beside them. Kaelin studied the sculptures. So the stories were true. Only half of them survived. Elara remained quiet. The deeper they climbed, the more strongly she felt something pulling at her heart. It was not fear. It was recognition. Though she had never set foot upon the mountain before, every turn along the path felt strangely familiar. The pups sensed it too. They ran ahead in playful bursts before stopping to make sure she followed. None of them ever wandered far from her side. At sunset, they reached the great doors. They towered above the company, twice the height of the tallest pine, their surfaces covered with flowing patterns that shimmered faintly beneath the evening light. No handle could be seen. No lock. Only the carving of 9 wolves gathered around a single human figure. The old seer looked toward Elara. It has waited for you. I don't know what to do. You already do. Elara stepped forward hesitantly. The smallest silver pup nudged her hand. She smiled softly and placed her palm against the cold stone. Nothing happened. A flicker of disappointment crossed her face. Then the black pup pressed its tiny paw against the stone beside her hand. One by one, the other 8 pups did the same. Silver light spread beneath their paws like flowing water. Ancient symbols awakened across the great doors, filling the mountain with a warm, steady glow. The earth trembled. Slowly, almost reverently, the massive doors began to open. A breath of warm air drifted out from the darkness within, carrying the scent of cedar, wildflowers, and rain, a fragrance no one present had breathed in since before the endless winter began. As the doors opened wider, countless crystal lights awakened inside the hidden hall, revealing a vast chamber untouched by time. At its center stood a stone pedestal. Resting upon it was a single silver circlet shaped from intertwining wolf branches. Above it, etched into the ceiling in letters that glowed like moonlight, were words that had not been read for centuries. Power belongs to the one who protects the helpless before themselves. Behind the company, unnoticed by all but a pair of golden wolf eyes watching from the cliffs, a lone shadow slipped silently back toward Frostveil. Cedric had not abandoned the hunt. He had simply chosen a darker path. The ancient words lingered in the air long after their silver glow had settled into the stone. Power belongs to the one who protects the helpless before themselves. No one spoke. The warm breath flowing from the hidden sanctuary wrapped around the travelers like the first true spring in countless years. Snow that clung to their cloaks melted into clear droplets, soaking silently into the polished floor. Tiny streams ran through narrow channels carved into the white stone, feeding pools so still they reflected the ceiling like perfect mirrors. Elara stood motionless at the entrance. The 9 pups stepped inside first. Not with excitement. With quiet certainty. Each tiny paw landed upon the ancient floor as though they had walked these halls before, though they had opened their eyes to the world only days earlier. Their silver markings shimmered faintly beneath the soft light, filling the sanctuary. Kaelin remained several steps behind her. This place, he whispered, was built to be remembered. The old seer slowly nodded.
No.
Her eyes wandered across the towering pillars carved with wolves standing beside ordinary men, women, and children. It was built so the world would never forget. The deeper they traveled into the sanctuary, the more impossible it became to believe it had slept beneath the mountain for centuries. Not a single cobweb hung from the vaulted ceilings. No dust covered the carved statues. Crystal lanterns embedded within the walls awakened one after another as Elara passed, bathing the halls in gentle moon-colored light. The silence was peaceful, not empty, almost welcoming. One of the pups suddenly broke away from the group. The tiny silver female trotted toward an enormous mural stretching across the eastern wall. Elara followed. Her breath caught. The mural showed wolves running beside travelers through heavy snow. Others carried children across rivers. Some guarded villages. None wore collars. None bowed before kings. At the center stood a woman dressed in simple gray robes, surrounded by 9 wolves of different colors. She was smiling. Not proudly. Kindly. Beneath the mural, ancient letters had been carved into the stone. The old seer brushed snow from the inscription. The keeper serves life. Never the throne. Kaelin read the words twice. So the legends lied. They were rewritten. The seer's voice carried no anger. Kings feared a power they could never command. Far behind the mountain, Alpha Cedric rode through the darkness, without stopping. Only 12 riders followed him now. Not because he lacked soldiers. Because those remaining had begun asking questions. Questions he could no longer answer. The forest seemed different tonight. Wolves watched openly from rocky ridges instead of hiding among the trees. None attacked. They simply observed. Cedric ignored them. He had spent years burying the truth. He would not allow compassion to destroy everything he had built. One rider finally urged his horse closer. My Alpha. Cedric did not look back. What? If the Covenant truly chose the Omega? It didn't. The wolves. The wolves are being deceived. The rider fell silent. Yet doubt lingered across every face. Cedric noticed. His grip tightened around the reins. He could still win. He only needed one thing. The crown stone. Hidden somewhere inside the Covenant Hall. With it, the wolves would obey again. Or so he desperately believed. Inside the sanctuary, the companions entered a circular chamber unlike any they had seen before. The ceiling disappeared high into darkness, where thousands of tiny crystals glowed like stars. 9 narrow streams flowed inward from every direction, joining together beneath a single stone platform. Upon it rested the silver circlet. Up close, it looked less like a crown and more like intertwined branches shaped into a simple band. No jewels. No gold. Only polished silver that reflected the surrounding light. The pups gathered around it. None attempted to touch it. Instead, they looked toward Elara. The old seer lowered herself onto one knee. It has waited generations. I don't understand. You don't have to. The elderly woman smiled warmly. Simply be who you've always been. Elara slowly approached. Every step echoed softly across the chamber. When she reached the platform, she hesitated. This belongs to someone stronger. Kaelin quietly shook his head. I've commanded armies. His gray eyes rested upon the sleeping pups. I've won battles. Then he looked at her. I've never carried 9 helpless lives through a blizzard while expecting nothing in return. The room fell silent again. With trembling fingers, Elara reached toward the circlet. The instant her hands touched the cool silver, light burst through the chamber. Not blinding. Gentle.
Warm.
It spread through every hallway of the sanctuary like dawn crossing a frozen valley. Outside, the mountain answered. Snow began sliding from ancient cliffs. Hidden waterfalls broke free from their icy prisons. For the first time in 7 long years, a single green blade of grass pushed through melting snow near the entrance. Miles away, villagers throughout Ironfang looked toward the mountains in disbelief. Children pointed toward rooftops where icicles dripped steadily beneath the afternoon sun. Old men stepped outside, without their heavy fur cloaks. Women opened shutters that had remained closed for years. Some simply stood in silence as birds returned to branches that had been empty through countless winters. Hope returned quietly, one heartbeat at a time. Back inside the sanctuary, Elara gasped. Memories not her own flowed gently through her mind. She saw generations of keepers guiding lost travelers, healing wounded wolves, ending disputes without drawing swords, protecting villages from hunger before protecting castles from invasion. Power had never belonged to rulers. It had always belonged to those willing to serve first. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. They gave everything, The old seer nodded, and asked for almost nothing. The silver circlet remained in Elara's hands, yet she made no move to place it upon her head. Instead, she knelt. She carefully lowered it back onto the stone. Kaelin looked surprised. "You refuse it?" She smiled through her tears. "It isn't a prize." Her fingers gently stroked the nearest pup. "It's a promise." The chamber brightened once more. The circlet lifted from the pedestal by itself. Slowly, gracefully, it settled upon Elara's head. No thunder shook the mountain. No overwhelming surge of power raced through her body. Only warmth. Only peace. The 9 pups pressed close around her feet. Across the sanctuary, every carved wolf lowered its head as if honoring the choice. Even Kaelin bowed. Not before a queen. Before a keeper. But peace lasted only a moment. A horn echoed from outside the mountain. Then another. Iron striking stone. The hurried footsteps of soldiers. One of Ironfang's scouts burst into the chamber, breathing hard from the climb. "My king." Kaelin turned immediately. "What happened?" "The southern pass." The scout struggled to catch his breath. "Frostveil isn't attacking alone." Every face grew still. "What do you mean?" The young soldier looked toward Elara. "There are creatures with them." His voice trembled. "Wolves." He swallowed. "But not living ones." A distant roar rolled through the mountain. Deep. Twisted. Unlike anything nature had ever created. The 9 young wolves immediately stood between Elara and the entrance, their soft growls echoing through the sacred hall. The Covenant had chosen its keeper. Now something ancient had come to challenge that choice. The roar rolled through the mountain like a storm trapped beneath stone. Dust drifted from the ancient ceiling as the crystal lights flickered. Every wolf inside the Covenant hall lowered its body, ears pinned back, not in fear but in warning. The sound carried no heartbeat, no rhythm of living breath. It was hollow, cold, as though something long dead had learned to imitate life. The scout staggered another step into the chamber, his face drained of color. "They came out of the southern pass," he said between ragged breaths. "Their eyes burn blue, but there is nothing alive behind them. They do not answer whistles. They do not stop for arrows. They simply keep walking." Kaelin's hand settled on the hilt of his sword. "How many?" "We counted dozens before the snow swallowed the rest." The old seer's expression darkened with recognition. "They are not wolves," she murmured. "They are what remains when grief is chained instead of released." Elara looked down at the 9 young guardians gathered around her feet. Their silver eyes reflected the soft light of the Covenant Hall, yet none of them growled in anger. They stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for her. "They're guarding me," she whispered. The seer gently shook her head.
No.
She smiled with quiet sadness. "They're waiting for you to lead them." Outside, another roar shattered the silence. The great doors of the sanctuary opened onto a world caught between winter and spring. Snow still covered the mountainside, but narrow streams of meltwater now wound through the valleys below. Here and there, patches of green grass pushed stubbornly through the white blanket, as though the land itself had remembered what hope looked like. Far down the slope, Ironfang soldiers formed a defensive line before the mountain path. Behind them stood frightened villagers who had fled from nearby settlements with children bundled in blankets and the few belongings they could carry. Kaelin frowned. "Why are civilians here?" One of his captains bowed his head. "The creatures ignored our forts." His voice tightened. "They went straight for the villages." Elara understood at once. "They're hunting fear." The captain looked confused. She watched a frightened little girl clutch her mother's hand, trembling so hard that tears froze upon her cheeks. "They're not trying to win a battle," Elara said quietly. "They're trying to make people lose hope." The old seer nodded. The Covenant was never built to protect kingdoms. Her eyes rested on the families below. It was built to protect hearts. A heavy mist drifted across the valley. Within it, shapes slowly emerged. At first they looked like ordinary wolves. Then the sunlight caught them. Their fur was gray as old ash. Cracks spread across their bodies like broken stone, and pale blue light leaked from those fractures instead of blood. Their eyes held no anger. Only emptiness. The largest among them stepped forward. Its body was nearly twice the size of any living wolf, and long scars covered its shoulders as though it had fought countless battles before death had claimed it. Ironfang archers drew their bows. Kalen raised one hand. Hold. The monstrous wolves stopped less than 50 paces away. Neither side moved. The wind carried only the soft cries of frightened children behind the soldiers. Then, to everyone's surprise, Elara stepped past the line of shields. "My lady," one captain shouted. She kept walking. Kalen reached for her arm, but stopped himself. The 9 young guardians followed without hesitation. One by one, they spread into a loose circle around her. Not to shield her, to stand beside her. The great ash-colored wolf lowered its head. Not in surrender. In exhaustion. Elara saw it then. The creatures were not attacking because they hated. They were wandering because they had forgotten how to stop. She slowly knelt in the snow. The soldiers behind her stared in disbelief. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. Elara removed her gloves despite the bitter cold. She stretched out one trembling hand. The enormous wolf took one slow step closer. Another. Its glowing eyes remained fixed on hers. Every heartbeat seemed to echo through the valley. Then its nose touched her fingertips. The blue light flickered. For the first time, warmth returned to its eyes. A single tear slid down the creature's scarred face before dissolving into silver mist. The old seer closed her eyes. "They were guardians," she whispered. "Long ago. Bound by a curse that outlived the ones who placed it upon them." One after another, the remaining wolves approached. Elara never moved. She welcomed each one with the same gentle hand that had gathered 9 helpless pups beneath a dying mother's body. Silver light spread outward from her touch. The cracks covering the wolves began to fade. Their heavy breathing slowed. Ash drifted from their coats, like snow carried away by the wind. Then, one by one, they dissolved into countless shimmering lights that rose peacefully into the brightening sky. No battle cry followed. No triumphant celebration. Only silence. The kind of silence that comes after pain finally finds rest. Far behind the retreating mist, a lone rider watched from the ridge.
Cedric.
His plan had failed. He had hoped the Curse Guardians would destroy Ironfang before the Covenant could unite the kingdoms. Instead, he had witnessed something he had spent years refusing to believe. Compassion had accomplished what fear never could. His horse shifted uneasily beneath him. For the first time in many years, Cedric looked not like a powerful alpha. He looked like a tired man standing alone. Kalen rode slowly up the ridge until only a few yards separated them. "You can still end this," Kalen said. Cedric laughed bitterly. "By surrendering?"
"No."
Kalen glanced toward the valley where wolves and villagers now stood together. "By choosing a different future." Cedric looked at Elara. Children from both kingdoms had gathered around her. The 9 young wolves played among them without fear. No one asked which child belonged to Frostveil. No one cared. Cedric lowered his eyes. The sword slipped quietly from his hand and disappeared into the snow. "I spent so many years protecting my throne," he said softly. "I forgot to protect my people." The wind carried away the last of the storm clouds. Above the mountains, sunlight finally spread across both kingdoms together. The endless winter had not ended because a king conquered his enemy. It had ended because one forgotten Omega had refused to abandon 9 helpless lives when no one else believed they were worth saving. And from that single act of kindness, an entire world found its way home.